So I'm happy and hearty and hale today, and I get to talk about slugs and snails. I will say that this is an interesting topic, but it's not necessarily one that's fully within my bailiwick as a bug guy. But I will try to extrapolate on what snails and slugs are and kind of their role in the environment, and then why we do end up dealing with them sometimes at the extension office. When we talk about them and when they are appearing, I'm just going to try and hide this meeting control thing. They tend to be considered like springtime and fall pests. They're usually some of the first pests that get out and get going in the spring. They really enjoy the cooler, damper weather. This period of really high rain that we've had earlier in the spring, I think, is going to result in quite a few slugs and snails that will be successful this season. They can persist throughout the summer, particularly in hidden areas or more shady kind of hidden spots in the landscape, but they are really more particularly profound in these cooler, damper areas. So the reason for this is, as we'll kind of discuss, there's certain aspects of their physiology that really can't deal with heat. They don't deal with dry weather as well, very well. And so if we start getting those kind of droughty periods in the summer and we get really, really high heat in the summer, that's just not when they do well. Their bodies are not built to live through that very easily. And so we start to see them taper off, but then they'll surge back up in the fall, particularly if we have a lot of precipitation towards the end of the summer. I do want to stress that these are not insects. They are mollusks. Technically, they are gastropods. That is the specific group within the mollusca that they belong to. The mollusks are, as a whole, a greater group. There's like clams. You could even throw in some of the squids and nautiluses and all kinds of crazy stuff in the mollusk group. If we get down into the gastropods, you're really talking more about the land and water-based snail and slug species. So the land snails, the sea slugs, all of these different things that vaguely look kind of like a big squishy blob and then have things that reach out off of their body. I do want to stress that the gastropod part of their name refers to kind of the main piece of anatomy that makes them unique from some of the other species that you may encounter. They have a foot that runs along the entire length of the bottom of their body. You can see it on this slug here. It's that kind of pad on the bottom of the body. Gastropod would be Latin for stomach foot, and it's just referring to the fact that their entire stomach area, their belly area, is coated with this foot that helps them to locomote. It helps them to move through the world. When we look between the snails and slugs and the insects that I typically work with, we can see some key differences. So I do want to just point some of these differences out because I want to keep these separated. I do feel as an entomologist, I get sent everything that's ooey gooey, grimy, and weird. And so people assume slugs and snails have some sort of connection to insects, but they're really quite distinct on sort of a phylogenetic tree. So if we look on the slugs and snails side, we're talking about soft-bodied organisms. These are sort of squishy sacs of fluid. They don't have an exoskeleton as we would sort of traditionally conceive of it. Insects, on the other hand, do have an exoskeleton. They're coated in this thick layer of wax that helps to keep all of their internal organs inside. It gives them a protective barrier. Slugs and snails, technically speaking, have sort of fragments of this, but it is not as hard or crunchy. And it can also be separate from the body itself. When we look at snails here in a second, that shell that they're famous for having is technically an exoskeleton. The other thing that slugs and snails have that insects do not is that they're slimy. People often complain about insects, and one of the things that they say is, oh, they're so gross, they're so slimy, they're so bleh. And really, there aren't a lot of slimy insects. There's not a lot of them that exude mucus all over their body to protect themselves. There are exceptions. We could talk about spittlebugs and a few others that live in froth and liquid, but for the most part, they're very dry on the exterior of their body, thanks to that waxy exoskeleton. Whereas with slugs and snails, they are obligate sort of mucus exuders. They are covered in a thick layer of mucus that helps to keep them wet and helps to keep them alive, and it also helps them to be able to move. If we look at the head of the slug, which is next to the words for feelers, you would see tentacles. That's usually what people would refer to them as. They are also called feelers, sometimes referred to as antenna, though they're not true antenna. But there are two pairs of them, so four total. There's a longer set on the top of the head, and those are for sight. And then there's two shorter, nubbier ones underneath, and those are more for tasting and accepting food that will then be sort of processed by their version of a mouth. They do not have any legs either. So I want to point that out. Again, there's that foot along the bottom of the body. Insects, they locomote through the use of distinct appendages, some legs that are attached to the thorax. There's also wings that are attached to the thorax on many insects, and that's how they move around. Slugs and snails, all they can do is sort of glue themselves to the ground with their foot and their mucus, and then pull themselves forward, kind of dragging themselves and crawling. There are some differences between slugs and snails, specifically the shell. Shells are produced by snails. Slugs have no snail shell on their back. That's how we differentiate between them. And if you have ever wondered how they acquire these shells, they actually build them themselves. So snail shells are exuded from the mantle. The mantle is a piece of the upper part of the snail's anatomy, and the mantle exudes calcium carbonate. And as they grow, they continue to add layers to the snail shell. So it does grow with their body. It starts out quite small when they first emerge from their egg. And as they add to it, it usually is done in a clockwise fashion. If you look at snail shells, you will typically notice that they kind of rotate in this clockwise spiral pattern. That is because, like a lot of humans, they tend to have a bias towards sort of right-handedness. I hesitate to say handedness since they don't have hands, but they sort of are biased towards the right, and that means that their shell will rotate in that clockwise fashion. Slugs, on the other hand, do not produce this. They have a mantle, they have remnants of this sort of shell-like exoskeleton that is produced by snails, but it is not as concentrated and it doesn't grow with them and protect them. That is the main function of the snail shell, is something that they can hide in, something that can protect their squishier, greater body. And it can be very ornate and very beautiful. Some people collect these. They're left behind when the snail perishes. The shell will be left behind, and you can sometimes find that in the garden as well, or you may find it along creek or pond edges as well. Get clicked out. I do want to say that there are quite a few snails and shells that call Kentucky home. Since this is a Kentucky-based program, I wanted to highlight that on iNaturalist, if any of you are interested, you could contribute to the Kentucky Land Snail and Slug Project. There are quite a few observations already and people that are participating, and they have caught through photographs over 200 species of snails and slugs that live in the state. So there is a pretty good level of biodiversity, and our forests and next to rivers and streams, we have so many frontages of rivers in Kentucky. It makes sense to me that we would have a lot of diversity for snails and slugs. I wanted to throw out just a few of the ones that you may more commonly encounter. One that I think is quite interesting is called the leopard slug. These are some of the bigger species that you would find out in the landscape. You may see them in the garden. They're distinct because they are coated with these patterns all over their body that vaguely resemble a leopard or a cheetah. They're a little bit bigger than some of the other slugs that you may notice, which would include something like the gray field slug. This is the one that, so I was just doing some gardening over the weekend, and I was picking through a few different garden bags and unpacking some things, and I found a whole bunch of these gray field slugs. They look shorter and nubbier in comparison to some of the other species. They are a non-native. A lot of slugs that you encounter will have been brought here accidentally during European colonization via ships and then produce that was on the ship, and then they were able to proliferate here. There are some native species, but I would say by and large, the ones that you're going to encounter don't necessarily belong here in North America. But this one is just sort of what you would draw if you were told to draw a slug, nothing really distinct about it. The other species that you could encounter in the slug group might include the changeable mantle slug. It looks a little bit like the leopard slug, but I would say it has more of a bark-like pattern to it rather than the sort of distinct spots and non-spot areas. They are in between the gray field slug and the leopard slug in size. So you're talking about a half an inch to an inch. It's really difficult to talk about slug and snail size because a lot like an earthworm, they can really stretch their bodies in strange ways. They can pump the fluids in there in weird sort of patterns. And so when they do that, they can get really long or become really short and nubby to try and protect themselves. But I would say you're looking at something kind of in that half to 1 inch range. The most common snail that's been found according to that Kentucky Land Snail and Slug Project is the white lip globe snail. I recognize that shell. I've definitely seen that in the state when I've been outside. It gets its name because the shell is kind of globular, kind of circular, except for that spiraling. And then if you look at the lip that is closest to the snail's body, it has a white tinge to it and gives it this white lip that separates it from the rest of the shell. So just a few examples of things that you may have seen before or that you may see here as we get the gardening season kicked off this year. Just pay close attention and see if you see any of their slimy bodies or their shells left behind. I did want to cover a little bit about how they persist in a state like Kentucky and a little bit about their sort of overwintering and mating biology. I will be very upfront before I get into this. This might be the most PG-13 or R-rated version of Horticulture Webinar Wednesdays because we're going to see some snails and slugs in action producing the next generation because it's very bizarre. So what I wanted to stress first is that they have overwintered as eggs. So in the late fall, the slugs and snails, they will find one another and slugs will mate with slugs and snails will mate with snails. As they mate, they will then both go off and produce eggs. These eggs are then hidden in protected areas. This can be anything outside, basically, a pile of moss, a pile of bark, mulch, anything that gives them sort of a protective barrier between the eggs and the air temperatures is where they're going to put these. Somewhere that moisture accumulates, it stays kind of damp and hidden. So if you put a pile of bricks out in your landscape, sort of in the fall time area, I would bet that there are going to be snail eggs underneath that. If you put some bags of soil out in the fall and leave them there till the spring, the same thing could happen. If you've got a wood pile, these would all be spots that would be kind of hot spots, very attractive to a snail or slug. Then the eggs hatch in the early spring. It allows for the slugs and snails to begin feeding and then growing, and it gives them sort of a foot up, if you'll excuse the expression, before other pests. So other things that may feed on new tender leaves, they are going to get beaten to the punch basically by snails and slugs because these eggs are so primed to get started in the really cool, really wet part of the year. In terms of how they produce the eggs, they do mate in very strange fashion. It would look very bizarre to our sort of human sensibilities to try and sort of parse out the mating process for them. And that's because slugs and snails are both hermaphroditic, meaning that they do not have sort of a sexual binary like we see with us and other mammals and other things. In terms of their mating process, they are both mating with the other one. Both partners are passing sperm from their body to the other body, and then both slugs and snails can walk away from the mating process ready to produce eggs. So there's not a male, there's not a female like we would see with an insect. They are both going to go and lay eggs, which I think is also very, is something that could be problematic because they are going to have lots of eggs that are being produced since they're both potentially reproductive. Sorry, there's lots of people popping in. So that means that there's going to be more eggs produced because it's kind of double your worth. You're getting two organisms that are ready to go out and then prepare eggs and lay them. Most species, when they mate, what they do is they will find one another and then they will press kind of their feet together and then they will press their full bodies together. As they do that, they're exchanging mucus. And the mucus for a slug species or a snail species is distinct. There are chemicals in it that separate them from other species so they're not interbreeding. And that helps to create the speciation that makes those different species I talked about before. After they confirm, okay, you're a part of the same group that you're somebody that I should mate with, they will both open a sort of genital opening and then they will pass sperm from one snail or slug to the other. And then the other one will do the same thing. And that's what you're seeing in these images. These are mating reproductive organs that are connecting, and then the sperm is being passed back and forth between them. Most of them, you would see them kind of locked together on the ground or on a leaf. There are others like the leopard slugs, which are some of the most common in Kentucky, which perform really spectacular and bizarre mating behaviors. So these are larger leopard slugs. What we see here is that they connected on a leaf in a tree or a shrub above them, and then they produce almost this like Spider-Man web where they will use the mucus to sort of drop down from the surface of that plant, and they will hang in midair, and they exude these really long mating organs together. and then they will connect and touch one another and pass sperm back and forth. So this is something that you could potentially see in the bluegrass state. I don't know how many of you are going to go looking for it necessarily, but it is sort of a really remarkable looking thing to come upon and to see them sort of winded together, almost like snakes that are trying to wrap around each other, and then to produce this weird, almost flower-like organ that will exude from their bodies and connect in order to help them facilitate the mating process. I apologize to my hosts. I didn't clear this with you before I brought it up today, but I thought it might be interesting for people to see. In terms of why we're talking about them today, they do become garden pests in the early spring. They also love to munch on ornamental plants. So it's not just things that you might be getting going in an early spring garden. I would say that the most slug and snail calls that I deal with are on hostas. They end up on hostas in the early part of the growing season, and they create these irregular holes that you see in the two images. We've also received samples that were on lilies. They'll get on violets. In terms of garden plants, they like beans, strawberries, and then springtime lettuce. All of these are kind of thin leaves that are not very well protected. They're very tender. They also like other plants when they're small. They can feed on them more easily. Soybeans can be impacted by slugs and snails. We've seen that in Western Kentucky where agriculture has been impacted. And so anything that's kind of tender, young, and just starting to get growing, but also some established plants that have those more defenseless leaves. They tend to feed at night. They don't like the sun. They don't like UV radiation. They also dry out in the sun. And they tend to be associated with more ornamental areas that have a lot of ground cover. So you see this kind of beautiful looking landscape. In this picture, we have a bench surrounded by large plants, all kind of overlapping one another, creating a lot of shade. This is probably a very cool and dark area for the homeowner or the person that goes to visit this park or wherever this would be to go and experience lower air temperatures and really feel like they're convening with nature. But this is also a hot spot for snails and slugs. They would look at this as sort of nirvana. It's all overlapping one another. They're not going to get dried out. There's probably not a lot of wind and air movement here. And so this is something that becomes a hot spot for them. They don't tend to bother plants in sunny areas. So something that's kind of in the strip of grass in front of your house, if you're in an urban area, that sort of hex strip area, they're not going to be there. Anywhere that you would call sort of the sunniest part of your yard, probably not going to be there. It's really where we put shade tolerant plants and have shady areas that we need to worry the most about. When they feed with a strange sort of rasp and file like mouth. So what they do is they will go up to these kind of tender parts of the plant. You can see the mouth in the image on the left. It's this circular opening, but then inside of it is a tongue that is called a radula. The radula will exude out of the mouth, and it looks a lot like a saw blade or a file, and they will rub it on whatever they want to eat, and it grinds pieces of it off, and then they will swallow those. And that's how they're ingesting their food. You can see these two happy snails get ready to go to town on this cucumber, and they're just licking it to death, basically. When they do this, it creates damage that superficially resembles caterpillar damage. It's lots of sort of irregular shaped holes spread throughout the leaves that sometimes congeal together to create widespread damage. The thing that separates the snail and slug damage from what we see with caterpillars, or even say something like a sawfly, would be the presence of mucus. So the early part of the year helps. If you see damage happening in March and April, caterpillars by and large are not getting active then. They need it to warm up a little bit more. So that helps. But there are some caterpillars that might have overwintered as larvae and are ready to go and ready to feed. The thing that we usually use to differentiate caterpillar damage from slug and snails would be the presence of just snot, this mucus that they make. You can see on this hand on the left, as they're pulling themselves forward, they're sort of gluing their foot down. They use the snot, the mucus that sort of exudes from their body to create suction, and they use that to pull and locomote themselves forward. As they do so, they leave a trail of this behind them. It's very shimmery, particularly in the morning. You can usually go out in the early morning when the dew is still around, and you can figure out pretty easily where snails and slugs have been because there will be kind of these spectral, silvery trails that go to and from plants and to and from hiding spots. And that's really what tells you that you've got a snail problem if you compare that with the irregular shaped holes. So the image on the right, we have a ragged leaf, we have some random holes in some leaves, and then we have the telltale trail that tells us what we're dealing with. If you wanted to manage for these, there are some things you can do to prevent them. Increasing the airflow into a given area by sort of reducing branches on the lower parts of trees can allow the air to come in and dry things out. If you pull some plants out, if you do more weeding, or if you have an ornamental area like this, and you can kind of sacrifice some of these plants to get more light to filter in, it does discourage gastropod success. They're not going to live there as easily because they'll burn up. We can also try to improve drainage if you can get the water to run away from the area or add more drainage areas to it. You can also try to remove some objects that may house them. In this image, I may look at those pavers, those stones. Those could be hot spots for snails and slugs if they don't want to do anything to the landscape itself. There can be logs. There can be decorative items, a statue of St. Francis or a big sort of stone owl or a stone bench outside. Those can be things that if they're moved to a sunnier area, it can create less habitat for the snails and slugs to persist in. We can also trap for them. Trapping can be done through two main methods. The sort of original method, the older method, is to use a board or stone trap. You can also substitute wet newspapers. I've even seen people use shingles. So if you have spare shingles that you're not using for your roof, you can put these in the garden or the ornamental area. You're essentially creating somewhere that they want to hide in during the day. So they'll go under the board or in between the layers of the newspaper. And then you can usually just simply pick these up. If you have a bucket with you, maybe filled with soapy water, you can dunk them in there and they'll fall off and drown and die. You can also scrape them off. You can throw them into a garbage can. You can squish them if you're feeling particularly malicious against them. Anything to kind of remove or kill them. It just concentrates them in one area and allows you to do a quicker sort of mechanical method of control. The other thing that more and more people are turning to are beer traps. So beer traps are exactly what they sound like. People tend to use, so this is a watering dish for the bottom of a potted plant on the right that's been filled with some sort of beer. And then this is sort of set out in the garden area. It's nestled into the soil until it's snug. So it's very easy for them to crawl in. Slugs are attracted to the smell of fermenting materials. They will go to fermenting strawberries or fermenting fruit as well. But if you put beer out, they'll crawl into the beer, and then essentially they have themselves too much fun to death. They will drown in the beer and perish and then get pickled. As you can see on the right, it's very easy to empty this out every morning. I will stress that other things are going to be interested in this. You may find some drunk raccoons, for example, or I don't know, some UK freshmen that have found the beer trap and they're slurping out of it as well as the snails and slugs. But this is very effective. You can remove large swaths of the population with relatively little impact on the environment. Most other things aren't going to crawl into this, and you can kill a lot of slugs in particular with it. In terms of what beer to use, there's a lot of contention about that. I would actually love to do a research project where we rank different brands of beer. If anybody has a particularly bad slug problem and they want to volunteer their slugs for a taste test, I've been told by some that they prefer the really cheap light beers. So whatever you can buy in like a 48 or 68 pack. I've also had some people that swear by using things like Guinness, so the darker beers, more international beers. They've claimed that they have a higher smell to them, and it seems to attract more. But I've not seen any data on that. Most people tend to use the cheapest beer, and most people tend to have one for themselves and then one for the snails and slugs as they're putting it out in the environment. The last thing that I'll mention are that you can create some issues for the snails and slugs by coating susceptible plants with diatomaceous earth. That's in the image on the left. Diatomaceous earth is very popular with a lot of gardeners, particularly those who are a little more organic minded. It does scratch insects to death. It can kill snails and slugs as they crawl through it. If you have a fine enough coating on the plant, it will scratch the snail and slug up and deter them from feeding. The problem with it is as soon as it gets wet, it's basically useless. So if it rains onto your diatomaceous earth, or if you irrigate, you've basically reduced its efficacy to zero and you'll have to reapply it. Most people aren't too averse to that, just so long as they still have some on hand, but that can help to repel them. The sort of ultimate weapon in the fight against snails and slugs are baits. We don't necessarily advertise baits as the first line of defense, but there are things like iron phosphate and ferric sodium and metaldehyde that you can put out and the snails and slugs will consume, and then it will slowly kill them. It poisons them from the inside, just like a rat bait would. The problem with these are that they look a lot like what you see on the right, They're kind of brightly colored bait capsules. And sometimes kids have found these and thought that they found candy and eaten them. Dogs in particular will walk around and lick these up, and it can make them very, very sick. So we try to be very cautious with the use of baits. We don't want to just advertise their use all over the place, and we don't want to use them in a widespread fashion. These would be for very, very high populations and are typically deployed in agricultural settings rather than home garden settings. We have lots of other tools that we can use at home. That's my whirlwind tour of the world of snails and slugs. I appreciate the opportunity to join you. I'm happy to chat and answer any questions.